Welcome to another Pixeled Moment, and if you're watching this video next week, then you're a week late after it uploaded, but if you're watching it last week today, then we're taking you back
to the future!
In time for more nostalgia. So last week, watched all three Back to the Future movies, and I've watched all three of these movies so often since I was a kid. I've kind of gotten into the habit of watching them with the commentary tracks. If you've got the DVD or the Blu-ray, there are two tracks for each film. One is with Bob Zemeckis and Bob Gale, the director and producer, and the other one is with Bob Gale and Neil Canton, who wrote for the films. And just looking back at these, I think I'd have to say Back to the Future is, for me, the best trilogy ever. Not saying that it's necessarily perfect, but yeah, it is my favorite, and I think it's the best. And now, you know, looking back, comparing how I saw it when I was a kid to how I'm seeing it as an adult, or how things have changed that I've viewed within the films over the years. Back to the Future 1, obviously it was written as its own movie. There wasn't any intention to make a 2 or a 3, even though I'm glad they did. You know, the last shot of the car flying off, it was just a joke, which I don't think I knew that until it was revealed later, but that's okay. I mean, in and of itself, Back to the Future was just a great example of storytelling and how to write a simple concept into a very complex story. You know, the concept being main character gets trapped in a situation that he's trying to get out of, and so you've got resolution here, resolution there, and like other people have said on YouTube, I know I'm not the first one to say it, that almost every action that Marty McFly does results in either something else happening further down the line or him solving the problems and changing what had happened. You know, it gave moviegoers so many memorable moments, like, you know, seeing a car with all those lights for the first time. And after that, it's like we all wanted a DeLorean, and you know, we all wanted them to have little buttons and lights inside, and I think that would still be cool as far as we are today. And I think it's also cool that outside of where I am, a little outside of Houston, I think the company is still around that actually makes or restores DeLoreans, which is really cool. You know, as kids, when we heard Johnny Be Good for the first time, it was like, oh cool, now I really want to get into rock and roll and maybe learn guitar, which, you know, I've got bass, but myself and friends and other kids around the neighborhood would just act out scenes from the movie. And seeing all the skateboarding done in the film, both in 1985 and more on the action sequence in 1955, it's like, oh, Marty sort of invented skateboarding back then. And we thought, cool, and those of us in the neighborhood who had a skateboard would act out scenes as Marty McFly. And I never learned to skateboard, and I still can't. I just cannot balance on those things. Also from that, just the memorable one-liners, or just the memorable lines in general, the dialogue, it was just almost perfectly written. Got things like,
say hi to your mom for me.
I always wear a suit to the office.
Well, listen to this!
Where we're going, we don't need roads.
88 miles per hour!
Watts of electricity.
21 gigawatts!
Great Scott.
you know, it's not necessarily in our vocabulary, but try to say
Hey, Scott!
every time something extraordinary happens. I'm not sure who came up with that phrase, but I like it. And even the non-action sequences, you know, we'd still just play pretend as kids, just act out any scene we could, because that was just one of the most memorable movies of childhood for those of us who were born or grew up around that time. I was only about 6 or 7 months old when that movie came out. And things I learned as I got older about the film, details, whether it was technical or story or character driven, things like Marty's mom having the hots for him in 1955 kind of didn't have the same kind of impact when we saw it as kids, because we really didn't think about awkward things like that. And the older we got, we really noticed just how much of a dick Biff was.
Can I assume that your insurance is going to pay for the damage?
My insurance. It's your car. Your insurance should pay for it. I want to know who's going to pay for this.
I mean, we knew he was the bad guy, but, you know, and Thomas F. Wilson just played that character perfectly. He played all the characters throughout the time so differently. It's like you never really thought Thomas F. Wilson, except maybe the 1985 Biff we see in the beginning, or maybe the 1955. And learning later on, it's like, oh, that's not who Thomas F. Wilson is. He's one of the nicest guys on the planet. Michael J. Fox doing Family Ties at the same time during the day, filming and rehearsals and barely getting any sleep on the car ride over to shoot all the night scenes on Back to the Future, is like, you can only do that when you're young. You know, I don't think you can do that when you're older, unless you just got that much willpower. I don't know. And it's not to say, you know, nobody else played their part great, because they did. You know, J.J. Cohen, who I think almost was the original Biff, but I think the height between him and Eric Stoltz at the time, who was the original Marty McFly, like, yeah, I can see why things needed to be changed from a visual perspective. And so glad they went with a mobile car rather than a refrigerator for a time machine, because yeah, that's a little more exciting. And I mean, I don't know the details because there are so many different perspectives on the stories, but I did think it was a shame that producer, you know, Bob Gale and Crispin Glover, who played George, just conflicted so much and had so many differing ideas that, you know, it didn't work out for the sequels. It's a shame, but it is what it is. And seeing the lights all around the Gamble house, I think it was, I forget who the architects were, but the exterior of the Gamble house that we see in 1955, Doc Brown's house back then, and the interior, which was, I think they said was the same architects, but it was a different house for the interior for the first film. I think they got to use the Gamble house for the interior on the beginning of the third film, I think. I still want one of those houses, or at least that same kind of architecture. You know, the lights in the yard were just right. The lighting throughout the whole film for everything was just right. And what made that a little different from almost all the other 80s movies that I've seen, whether they're adventure or whatever genre they are, was Robert Zemeckis, the director, his choice to use certain lens and the depth of focus between whatever's happening in the foreground and the background. And that really differentiated it a lot from other movies of the time. And I think that's one of the factors that's helped it stand the test of time. Just the visual perspective of the film technically, and the storytelling itself. Got to reiterate that. And of course, it introduced us to Chuck Berry and the great Huey Lewis in the news. I'm really glad he knew how to write memorable songs, especially for that film. And of course, composer Alan Silvestri, who just, you know, everything about his work was great. And since then, when I saw the movie Flight of the Navigator, and I say, oh, Alan Silvestri composed that too, and more electronic, but it's like, still really cool. He knows what he's doing and how to make variations on a theme and just how to adapt to a different structure and all that. It's like, it's good composing. And Back to the Future 2, yeah, it's it depends on how you look at it. You know, when we see them go into the future for the first act of the film, it's like, that's pretty cool and exciting. You know, all the different things and possibilities of what we thought might happen. Obviously, it didn't. One of the great things about Thomas F. Wilson, reiterating again about his acting ability, I never really paid that much attention until this most recent time that I watched Back to the Future 2, of how he was portraying Griff. And then when Griff's going to get his hoverboard, and just his facial movements are just like, huh, that's really good. And of course, we all wanted a hoverboard after seeing that, but at the same time, it's like, well, if you can't skateboard, you're probably not gonna have much luck on a hoverboard. But I started wondering, like, how did they make those? Are we gonna actually have to wait until 2015 to get those? Like, how do we get those? I kind of want one, but I'm not sure if I should have one. But then after the action sequence and everything that happened in the middle of Hill Valley in town, then once they went to the neighborhood, then the movie just started to get a little boring. And this is me speaking from the perspective, you know, when I was younger, when I first saw it as a kid. I must have been like, I don't know, 7, 8, or 9, or 10, something like that. And from there, you know, when they go back to 1985, it's like, okay, we're back in this. It's dark, it's bad, so it's kind of uncomfortable to see. But it just felt kind of boring because we had seen that environment already, or we'd seen 1985 already. And then when they go further back into 1955, it felt kind of like, okay, we gotta see most of these same scenes again. When I got older, learned that no, they recreated those scenes wonderfully from the different angles. Now that, you know that as a filmmaker. It's like recreating the whole dance scene, getting most of the people and the same lighting crew, so they had the same lighting setup, and how they did that, that was amazing, looking back on it. But as a kid, it was kind of boring and we didn't know any better. And of course, the ending, not a complete resolution because it was a setup to go into the third one. And I think a lot of films have sort of had that trouble, if you will. You know, kind of like if you were to say, you know, the second Matrix movie wasn't as good because it was just a setup for the third one, or, you know, Lord of the Rings, The Two Towers, setting up for the Return of the King, but that's different. I don't know if we'll get into those. But as I got older, I had a better understanding of, it's not so much that it was boring, it's still good storytelling, still good writing, good dialogue, good characters, good everything. I'm not saying it's a bad film at all. It's just the rewrites that they had to do and the tone of the film just getting darker. That's what it had to be for the story to continue. You know, in order for somebody to do one cause and effect. And after they got back from 2015 and then going back even further to 1955, you know, you look at it subconsciously wondering, well, what are they going to do that's novel? Or is there any new and cool one-liners that someone's going to say? And it wasn't so much that, but you do have to understand and adjust. It was more about continuing the story first and foremost, and that's perfectly understandable. But now the third film, that's my personal favorite. As great and as novel as the first one was, the third one, just, you know, we get to go inside the gamble house, we get to see that beautiful architecture. We get to go back into the Old West, because, you know, most Americans, you know, through the 50s television and all that, and that, you know, they based bits on those old 50s TV westerns, I'm sure. That's, again, listen to the commentary, because you can learn so much more than I could say, because these videos are just a nice nostalgia trip for me. But we've kind of romanticized the Old West. Not that that's what it actually was back then, because I think a better, more realistic perspective would be to watch the Deadwood series, which is also still my favorite HBO series of all time. But it was just such a really nice visual aesthetic to look at. Just the look of the Old West Hill Valley and the structures, and just something about the old wooden buildings and, you know, riding horses everywhere. That's just cool. Searching in a mine, you know, and different visual effects put on the DeLorean. And it's always a treat to see Monument Valley in anything, since I haven't been able to travel there yet. And although it seems like everyone in the town, or almost everyone, is just happy-go-lucky, it's, you know, it is what it is for the purposes of the film. But I can't imagine the saloon being that upbeat in reality. If it was, you know, there's no barroom brawl happening. It's like, come on, somebody's got to do that. Some of the characters that I first saw in Back to the Future 3, like Matt Clark, Harry Carey Jr., and Dub Taylor, Pat Buttram, like ever since then, other TV shows or movies that I've seen them in, I always have that reaction of like, oh yeah, they were in Back to the Future 3. I think that's cool for anything. The first time you see an actor in anything, and then subsequently when you see him in something else, you're like, oh yeah, they were in this. I just think that's nice. And Mary Steenburgen's character, she always struck me as kind and sweet and soft-spoken as she was. She always seemed like this school teacher and this lady who could still take care of herself if things hadn't progressed how they were supposed to according to the timeline. The more simplistic concept of being trapped in a time you don't want to be in, or in a situation you don't want to be in, and then coming up with actions and resolutions to solve problems and get back to where they needed to be. You know, again, good writing, good storytelling. And as a kid, yeah, we saw, you know, Buford Tannen as a bad guy, but the older I got, the more I realized, oh, no, he's really bad. This is the most dangerous version of, you know, an outlaw gunslinger, Buford Tannen, who can shoot almost anybody he wants to and possibly get away with it, even though we don't see it because they had to cut that scene out of the film to keep the pace going, which I understand. All the little subtleties that I may not have caught as a kid, like when Marty and Doc are at the train station talking about the map and the ravine, and the camera pans, and if they hadn't said in the commentary that Mary Steenburgen was right behind them, waiting for somebody to pick her up at the station, I don't think I ever would have noticed that. Like, that's really cool, all these subtle little details in each scene that it makes you want to watch it again and again to pick up little details. And that's what I loved about, you know, the Jaws series that I talked about in the last video, and this series and other series. It's really cool to try to pick up details you may not have caught the first 100 times. You know, whether it's a sound effect or just a little subtle visual detail. And the nice little references to Clint Eastwood and A Fistful of Dollars, which I hadn't seen that movie at the time, but then once I got to see that, it's like, oh, little armor Marty has, like, oh, cool, that's where they got it from. It's just a happy trip down memory lane and a very good visual to conclude a series on, you know, make a train that can fly. And all of a sudden it's like, okay, everybody wants a flying train. Which, yeah, who wouldn't still want a flying train? That's still cool. I still wish they had made, you know, toys or giant models of that train with all the effects and lights on it. Because, you know, we're attracted to shiny visual things like that. I understand it was what it was, having to change actresses for Back to the Future 1 to 2, you know, going from Claudia Wells to Elizabeth Shue, both playing Jennifer, and both did a fantastic job. That was cool that they got Claudia Wells to come back, I think, for one of the video games. But yeah, just listening to the commentary tracks and rewatching the films once a year, it's fun to sort of piece the timeline and, you know, cause and effect together like that. And that's a big reason why, you know, it's the best trilogy, I think. But, you know, leave a comment down below if you agree or disagree, you know, which is your favorite trilogy and why. I guess that means next week's video is gonna have to be about my other favorite film. So tune in for that too. Again, if you like this video, give it the old thumbs up. And until then, be excellent, and I will see y'all in the future.